There are very few foods we love as universally as cheese. Think about it. It's the gooey, stringy heart of our favorite pizza. It's what makes a grilled cheese sandwich the ultimate comfort food. It's the sophisticated centerpiece of a dinner party, the salty kick on a salad, the humble slice on a burger. It's everywhere, from the cheapest processed single to the most expensive hand-aged wheel that costs more than a car payment. But here's the fundamental and kind of unsettling truth about every single one of those cheeses. Underneath all the fancy packaging and the delicate flavors, cheese is a science experiment in managed decay. It's spoiled milk, that sublime, crumbly wedge of aged Parmesan, that pungent, creamy blue. It's all born from a process that, if you just left it to its own devices, would turn into a puddle of putrid sludge. It's a living, breathing ecosystem of bacteria, molds, and enzymes, all locked in a carefully controlled battle against putrefaction. So how did we get here? How did our ancestors, thousands of years ago, look at a perishable liquid that goes bad in a matter of hours and not see a liability, but an opportunity? How did they figure out how to tame an invisible army of microbes, to conduct a symphony of decay, and to transform that ticking time bomb into one of the most stable and celebrated foods on the planet? Well, that's our story, the story of how humanity learned to master rot, and in the process, created cheese. So, we've established that the entire world of cheese, from the fancy to the familiar, is built on the foundation of controlled rot. Spoiled milk, tamed by science. And the scale of what that idea has become today is just staggering. If you were to add up all the cheese sold around the world in a single year, you'd be looking at a global market of over $180 billion. That's more than the entire global market for coffee. We spend more money on curdled milk than we do on our planet's favorite stimulant. And we're not just talking about one or two things here. There are, and this is a conservative estimate, more than 2,000 distinct, named varieties of cheese in the world. 2,000 different recipes for decay, perfected over centuries. Think about the sheer, insane range that represents. On one end, you have cheeses that are basically national treasures, something like French Roquefort. And that name isn't just marketing, it's the law. To be called Roquefort, your cheese has to be made from the milk of a very specific breed of sheep in a specific region of southern France, and aged in specific limestone caves that contain a naturally occurring mold, Penicillium roqueforti. It's what the French call terroir, the idea that a food can literally taste like the place it comes from. It's a piece of geology and biology you can eat. And then, on the complete other end of the spectrum, you have the comforting, fluorescent orange joy of mac and cheese powder, or that perfectly square slice of American cheese, engineered to melt into a flawless, gooey blanket without ever breaking a sweat. Or, God help us, the spray cheese that comes in a can. But here's the thing, they all count. From the wheel that costs more than a mortgage payment to the packet of powder that costs less than $1. It's all part of the same incredible, sprawling family tree. A tree that has its roots not in a sterile factory or a government-protected cave, but somewhere much humbler and a whole lot more accidental. So we've established that cheese is a massive global industry, a sprawling multi-billion-dollar empire of controlled decay. But its influence goes so much deeper than what's sitting in our fridges. The truth is, cheese doesn't just occupy a space on our plates. It occupies a huge amount of real estate inside our minds. It's baked right into our language and our psychology. Think about it. When we want someone to smile for a picture, what do we tell them to say? It's the one word guaranteed to pull the lips back into the shape of a grin. Say cheese. We literally use curdled milk to manufacture joy. And on the flip side, what's our go-to word for something that's sentimental in a cheap, uncool, or inauthentic way? Cheesy. A bad pickup line is cheesy. A corny movie ending is cheesy. The word itself suggests something that's a bit past its prime, maybe starting to smell a little off, and that's exactly where the term comes from. It started in the 1800s as student slang, a way to describe something as cheap or of inferior quality. just like a low-grade, sad-looking block of cheese. How can one food be both the very picture of happiness and the name for our most cringe-worthy moments? And then there's the really weird stuff, the stuff of folklore. I'm talking, of course, about the cheese dream. For centuries, people have sworn that eating cheese before bed, especially a strong, pungent one, gives you vivid, terrifying, or just plain bizarre nightmares. It's such a common belief that in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge blames his first ghostly vision on, and I quote, a crumb of cheese. Now, for a long time, this was just seen as an old wives' tale, but in 2005, the British Cheese Board, which is a real thing, decided to actually run a study. And what they found was, well, it's complicated. It turns out cheese doesn't seem to cause nightmares at all. In fact, most people in the study reported sleeping quite well. But, and this is the crazy part, the type of cheese did seem to influence the type of dream they had. People who ate Stilton reported wild, fantastical dreams. Cheddar made them dream of celebrities. It's absolutely insane. So you have this one food that can force a smile, serve as an insult, and might just be able to rewire your subconscious while you sleep. It's a comfort food, a cultural touchstone, and a psychological wildcard. And it begs the question, how did a simple food, just spoiled milk, end up with this much power over our brains? How did it become a cornerstone of our culture before it was even a reliable thing to eat? Well, to answer that, we have to go back. Way back. Before the laws, before the scientists, and before anyone really knew what the hell they were doing. Alright, so we've left off with a big question. How did this simple, spoiled food gain so much power? To answer that, we have to find its source. And if I asked you to picture the homeland of cheese, where does your mind go? Probably somewhere in Europe, right? You're picturing a quaint little village in the French countryside, with a fromagerie on the corner. Or maybe a sun-drenched hillside in Italy, where some wise old nonna is teaching her family a secret recipe for parmesan that's hundreds of years old. You think of brie, of camembert, of gouda and gruyere. The story of cheese feels, almost fundamentally, like a European story. But that's not where the story begins, not even close. The truth is, by the time the Gauls and the Romans were just beginning to figure out how to make basic salty curds, cheese was already an ancient food, thousands of years old. The idea that cheese has a single linear history that flows out of France or Italy is a modern marketing invention. A story we tell ourselves because that's where the most famous and most expensive cheeses come from today. Here's the real story. Cheese doesn't have one beginning. It has lots of them. It wasn't invented by one person in one place. It was an idea that seems to have erupted independently, spontaneously, all across the Neolithic world, somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. So how do we know this? Well, we can thank the archaeologists. For decades, they'd been digging up these strange perforated clay pots from ancient settlement sites all over the world. In Poland, in Croatia, in the Fertile Crescent. For years, nobody knew for sure what they were. Some kind of ceremonial vessel, an ancient honey strainer. And then, scientists decided to run a chemical analysis on the residue scraped from the inside of these 7,500-year-old shards. And what they found was a massive concentration of milk fats. Specifically, milk fats that had been deliberately separated from the liquid whey. These weren't just pots. They were the world's oldest cheese strainers. And it all makes perfect sense when you think about what was happening. This is the dawn of the agricultural revolution. Humanity is settling down. We've just figured out how to domesticate herd animals, goats, sheep, and aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cows. And for the first time in history, we have a surplus of milk. But we also have a massive life or death problem. Without refrigeration, raw milk goes bad. Fast. It's a ticking time bomb of bacteria. So these Neolithic farmers weren't trying to create a delicacy. They were trying to solve a logistics crisis. They were hacking food preservation. They were taking this incredibly nutritious, but incredibly volatile product, and figuring out how to transform it into something stable, a portable, durable, life-saving source of protein and fat. The invention of cheese wasn't about taste. It was about survival, which sets up one of the greatest accidental discoveries in the history of food. So, we know our Neolithic ancestors had a problem. They had this incredible new resource, milk, but it was a ticking time bomb. They somehow discovered that if you could separate the solids from the watery liquid whey, you got a product that lasted. The cheese strainers prove it. But that just raises an even bigger question. How did they figure that out? How do you even come up with the idea to separate a liquid into two parts, one of which is suddenly shelf-stable? It's not an obvious conclusion. Well, like so many of the greatest discoveries in human history, it probably wasn't a conclusion at all. It was a happy accident. And the most likely story of that accident starts with a very common Neolithic piece of technology, a canteen made from an animal's stomach. I want you to picture this. You're a shepherd, thousands of years ago, somewhere in the Fertile Crescent. You're taking your flock on a long journey across the hot, arid hills. You need to bring a drink with you. There are no plastic bottles, no thermoses. Your best option for a waterproof container is a pouch made from the dried stomach of a goat or a sheep. So, you take a pouch, maybe from a young lamb you butchered recently. You pour some of your fresh, warm milk inside, tie it to the side of your donkey, or sling it over your shoulder, and you set off under the baking sun. For hours, that milk is sloshing around. It's heating up. And most importantly, it's mixing with whatever was left inside that stomach pouch. And here's the unbelievable part, the part our shepherd had no way of knowing. The fourth stomach of a young ruminant, a calf, a lamb, a kid goat, is full of a powerful enzyme complex called rennet. Its entire biological purpose is to curdle its mother's milk, to help the baby animal digest it. And so, when our thirsty traveler finally stops for a break and unstoppers his pouch, he doesn't find milk. Instead, he finds a lumpy, semi-solid white mass floating in a cloudy yellowish liquid. His milk is ruined. Or is it? Maybe out of desperation, or just sheer curiosity, he tries a piece of the solid stuff. And what he tastes isn't sour, spoiled rot. It's something else. It's tangy, it's salty, and it's substantial. And more importantly, the next day, it's still good. And the day after that. He had, completely by accident, stumbled upon the magic trick. He had used an invisible enzyme to transform a fleeting liquid into a durable, portable, life-sustaining solid. This was the Genesis moment. The first primitive cheese. It wasn't about flavor or craft. It was about creating calories that could travel. And once that secret was out, once we understood that this particular bit of animal anatomy held the key to preserving milk, the real experimentation could begin. The age of cheesemaking had officially dawned. All right, so we have our origin story. A happy accident in a sheep's stomach canteen that reveals the magic of rennet. And we have our circumstantial evidence, those weird perforated pots dug up all over the Neolithic world, which look a whole lot like cheese strainers. For decades, that combination, a plausible story and some suggestive artifacts, was the best we had. And it's a great story. But that's all it was, a story. How do you actually prove it? How do you look at a 7,000-year-old piece of broken pottery and say with absolute certainty, this was used to make cheese? You can't just ask the people who made it. It's one of the hardest things to do in archaeology, to prove not just what a tool was, but exactly how it was used. Well, that all changed in 2002. An international team of archaeologists was working at a site in Kujawia, a region in central Poland, and they found a treasure trove of pottery shards from a Neolithic farming culture, dating back about 7,200 years. And among those shards were, you guessed it, more of those same perforated pots. But this time was different. Instead of just looking at the pots, the team, led by scientists from the University of Bristol, decided to apply a brand new kind of chemical forensics. They were going to analyze not just the pot, but the invisible ghosts of molecules that had soaked into the clay itself over thousands of years. And what they found was the smoking gun. Using gas chromatography, they analyzed the fatty acid residues trapped in the pores of the clay. Now, they didn't just find milk fat. That would have been interesting, but it wouldn't have been definitive proof of cheesemaking. The pot could have just been used for storing or drinking milk. Here's the incredible part. The perforated shards were absolutely loaded with milk fats. But the chemical signature showed that it was milk that had been processed. The fats that you find in liquid whey were gone, which means only one thing. The whey had been drained away, right through those little holes, leaving the solid, fatty curds behind. It's the chemical fingerprint of an action, frozen in time. This was it. The moment the story became fact. Our ancestors, 7,200 years ago on the plains of Poland, weren't just drinking milk. They were engineering it. They had turned a lucky accident into a repeatable industrial process. They had the tool. They had the technique. And now that they could reliably turn milk into a life-saving, portable food, the real experimentation could begin. The journey of turning survival into an art form was officially underway. All right, so we've got our smoking gun, right? 7,200-year-old pottery from Poland with the chemical fingerprints of cheesemaking all over it. This is it, the moment our story moves from plausible theory to hard fact. We've found the origin. But here's the thing, that's not the whole story. Not even close. Because while those Neolithic farmers were perfecting their survival hack on the plains of Europe, a completely separate, and in some ways even more advanced, tradition was taking root hundreds of miles to the south, in the cradle of civilization itself, the Fertile Crescent. And the evidence we have from there isn't just pottery shards. We have picture books. In the ruins of the ancient Sumerian cities of Mesopotamia, archaeologists found cuneiform tablets dating back to around 3000 BC. And one of them, known as the Dairy Tablet, is basically a step-by-step instruction manual for cheesemakers. It's a series of pictograms, almost like a 5,000-year-old comic strip, that shows temple workers milking ewes, pouring the milk into large jars, agitating it, and then straining the curds through a reed mat. They knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't some happy accident anymore. This was a refined, repeatable process. It was an industry. And the Sumerians weren't alone. At the very same time, over in Egypt, the cheesemaking business was also booming. We know this because they painted it on the walls of their tombs, for real. Frescoes in burial sites from the same period show workers milking goats, working with curds, and placing finished cheese wheels into jars for storage. Apparently, cheese was considered an essential provision for the afterlife. They were literally packing a snack for eternity. So what this all tells us is incredible. It confirms that the idea of cheese didn't just happen once. It erupted, independently, in different places, with different people mastering the animals they had on hand. Sheep and goats in the Middle East, aurochs in Europe. Cheese wasn't a single invention spreading from one place to another. It was a universal solution to a universal problem, discovered and rediscovered all over the ancient world. The age of experimentation was over. The age of craft had begun. And now, this humble survival food was a staple of the world's first great empires. So now we have ancient empires, Sumeria, Egypt, running full-blown cheese industries. They've gone from a happy accident to a refined craft, with dedicated workers and official recipes painted right onto tomb walls. You'd think the problem of milk spoilage was completely solved. But here's the thing about all of this early cheese, it was still living on borrowed time. For all the expertise of the Sumerians and Egyptians, what they were making was essentially fresh cheese. Think of a farmer's cheese or a fresh ricotta. It was worlds better than raw milk, sure, but it was still soft, still full of moisture, and still highly perishable. You might get a week out of it, maybe 2 if you were lucky. It was a local food for local consumption. The clock was still ticking, just a little bit slower. Which brings us to the next, and maybe the most important, breakthrough in this entire story. The one simple addition that would transform cheese from a fleeting snack into a cornerstone of civilization. Salt. Now, on the surface, adding salt seems obvious. We salt everything. But what salt did to those fresh, wet curds was borderline miraculous. It was a chemical and biological game changer, and it worked in two fundamental ways. First, it's a desiccant. Basically, salt is incredibly thirsty, and it aggressively pulls moisture out of anything it touches. When you pack fresh curds in salt, gallons of leftover liquid whey are literally drawn out of the cheese, making it harder, denser, and far more concentrated. Less water means less real estate for the bad bacteria to grow. Second, and maybe more brutally, salt is a killer. It creates an environment so hostile that most of the nasty microbes that cause spoilage just can't survive. They get either dehydrated to death or just plain poisoned by all the sodium. It's a bouncer at the door of your cheese, and only a select few microbes are on the list. And with that one simple addition, the entire destiny of cheese was rewritten. It was no longer just a clever trick to stop milk from going bad. It wasn't even just a food that could last a few weeks. Suddenly, cheese became a durable, transportable, and storable powerhouse of nutrition. You could pack the caloric and protein value of a whole season of milk into dense, stable wheels that could last for months, even years. And that meant cheese wasn't just food anymore. It was wealth. It was a commodity. It was a strategic asset you could stack in a cellar. And this is the moment cheese gets ready for the big leagues. Because once your food can travel, it can feed armies. Once it can be stored, it becomes currency. And the humble, salty curd was about to become a foundational building block for the greatest empire the world had ever seen. So, we have it. The simple magic of salt has turned cheese from a perishable snack into a durable, transportable, and storable powerhouse of nutrition, a strategic asset. And this is the moment where cheese doesn't just change the way we eat, it fundamentally changes where we can live. It redraws the map of the human world. Now, you might be thinking the biggest impact of this would be felt in the settled empires, in the big cities where trade and commerce were already booming. And that story is coming. But the first, and maybe most radical, transformation happened out on the fringes, far from any city walls. It happened with the people who were always on the move, the nomadic pastoralists. For centuries, these herding cultures had lived in a delicate balance. They had meat, they had wool, they had fresh milk from their goats and sheep. But they were tethered. A day's journey with a pouch of milk was a race against spoilage. Their populations couldn't grow too large, and they couldn't wander too far from established agricultural centers where they could trade for grains. But what happens when you give these people salted, aged cheese? What happens when they can suddenly compress an entire season's worth of milk into dense, portable, calorie-rich wheels that last for months? Everything changes. Suddenly, you're not just mobile, you're supercharged. You're carrying a walking-around food surplus. You can leave the crowded river valleys and predictable pastures behind and push out into the vast empty grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. You can cross deserts. You can survive harsh winters. Your populations can explode because you have a stable food source that travels with you. And it turns out, this wasn't just some minor lifestyle upgrade. This was the engine for one of the largest human expansions in history. Many of the great pastoralist cultures that would come to dominate the Bronze Age, the speakers of the Indo-European languages who would spread out to become the ancestors of the Greeks, the Latins, the Persians, and the Celts, their migrations were powered by this technology. They were literally fueled by cheese. So while this humble food was helping to spread languages and cultures across thousands of miles of open plains, it was also being perfected by a culture that was doing the exact opposite. A culture that wasn't wandering, but building. A culture that would use the strategic power of cheese not to explore the world, but to conquer it. So we've seen how salted, aged cheese powered the great migrations that spread the ancestors of the Greeks and the Latins across Europe. By the time these cultures step into the full light of history, cheese isn't just a clever survival hack anymore. It's a foundational part of their world. It's so normal, so completely baked into their daily lives, that it becomes a backdrop for their greatest stories and their deepest philosophical questions. In fact, if you want what is probably the clearest, most detailed step-by-step account of ancient cheesemaking, you don't look in a farmer's manual or an agricultural treatise. You look in one of the most famous works of literature ever written, Homer's Odyssey. Now, when you think of the Cyclops Polyphemus, you probably just picture a giant, terrifying, one-eyed monster who tries to eat Odysseus and his crew. And he is. But here's the thing. He's also a shockingly precise portrait of a Bronze Age shepherd and cheesemaker. Homer describes his cave as being loaded down with woven baskets brimming with cheeses, with pens outside overflowing with lambs and kids. We see him sit down and milk his ewes, and then, in a line that would have made perfect sense to any Greek listener, he curdles half the white milk, and at once gathers the curds and packs them into his wicker baskets. He's running a one-man dairy operation. Those baskets are the very same cheese strainers archaeologists have been digging up for decades. And that's not just a throwaway detail. It tells us that for Homer's audience, cheesemaking was such a common and understandable craft that he could use it to paint a picture of daily life, even the daily life of a mythical monster. But it wasn't just a part of their epic poems. It was also key to how they imagined a perfect society. Which brings us to the philosopher Plato. In his famous work, The Republic, Plato tries to imagine an ideal, healthy city, a simple, just society, free from corruption and war. And when he lays out what the citizens of this utopia would eat, the menu is incredibly basic. They'll have bread and they'll drink wine. For a relish to go with their bread, they'll have salt, olives, and of course, cheese. For Plato, cheese was literally the food of a perfect world, a symbol of a pure, uncorrupted, and self-sufficient life. But here's what's really important. Plato contrasts his healthy city with a feverish city, a state bloated with luxuries, endless new desires, and conflict. And the Romans, who followed the Greeks, somehow managed to be both. They inherited that idea of cheese as the simple, perfect food, the ideal fuel for the common man. But they didn't use it to build a small philosophical utopia. They used it to build an empire. So, we left off with Plato, dreaming of a perfect, simple city fueled by bread, wine, and cheese, a utopia. But the Romans weren't in the business of building utopias. They were in the business of building empires. And where the Greeks saw cheese as a symbol of the good life, the Romans saw it as a tool, a strategic asset. They took the quiet, philosophical food of the Greeks and prepared to turn it into an industrial product. Now that's the thing about the Romans. They weren't really inventors, especially when it came to food. They were organizers. They were auditors. They were the world's first and maybe the best industrial-scale project managers. They looked at the rustic, localized craft of cheesemaking that existed all around them and thought, we can make this bigger. We can make this uniform. We can make this efficient. And so they did. They were obsessed with documentation. Roman agricultural writers like Columella wrote incredibly detailed, step-by-step manuals on animal husbandry and dairy production. They specified the best milk, the exact amount of rennet, the right way to press and salt the curds. This wasn't oral tradition anymore. This was a standardized operating procedure. They established massive, purpose-built dairy estates called caseae, the root of our word cheese, which were basically ancient factories dedicated to pumping out product. It wasn't an art, it was logistics. But why go to all this trouble? Why create a massive state-sponsored cheese industry? Well, that standardized, mass-produced cheese had one primary customer, the Roman army. A legionary on the march needed thousands of calories a day, and a significant chunk of that had to be protein. Grain was fine for porridge, but it was heavy and difficult to transport. Livestock slowed the army down. Cheese, on the other hand, was perfect. It was calorie-dense, portable, and, thanks to all that salt, incredibly durable. It was the power bar that fueled the conquest of the known world. And here's the real catalyst, the moment the map of cheese begins to transform into the one we know today. As the legions marched, the cheese marched with them. They pushed into Gaul, across the Channel into Britannia, and up to the Rhine frontier in Germania. And you can't haul millions of pounds of cheese all the way from Italy. So the Romans did what they always did. They built local supply chains. They brought their written techniques, their molds, their presses, and applied them to the local resources. They were teaching the Celtic tribes of Gaul how to make a hard, aged cheese from their cow's milk. They were showing the people of the misty British Isles how to preserve their dairy in a way that could last through a winter campaign. The Romans weren't just spreading their empire with swords and aqueducts, they were spreading it with cheese. They stamped their blueprint for cheese-making across an entire continent, planting seeds that would lie dormant for a few centuries, just waiting for the empire to fall so they could start growing into something new. So, the Romans had built it, a continental cheese-making machine, powered by legions and run by documented standardized procedures. They had spread their blueprint from the misty hills of Britannia to the dark forests of Germania, creating a vast, interconnected network of production. It was an incredible achievement of logistics. And then it all just broke. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, it wasn't a single event. It was a slow, agonizing implosion that took everything down with it. The armies that had protected the trade routes, gone. The paved roads that moved goods and information with unbelievable speed. They crumbled and became overgrown. The vast, centralized economy that demanded millions of pounds of cheese. It just vanished. But the real catastrophe for cheese was the loss of knowledge. All those incredible manuals, like Columella's detailed instructions for the perfect salted curd, weren't being copied and distributed anymore. They were locked away in isolated monastery libraries, if they weren't lost or burned altogether. The industrial, repeatable science of cheese-making, the very thing the Romans had perfected, was effectively wiped from the memory of Europe. So what was left? Well, you had pockets of tradition, a village in the mountains of Gaul where someone's great-grandfather had been taught by a Roman quartermaster, a farming community in the Italian countryside that still remembered how to press their curds. But these were no longer part of a system. They were islands, completely cut off from each other. The blueprint was shattered into 1,000 tiny, isolated pieces. Cheesemaking became a hyper-local, almost secret craft. It was passed down by memory, not by a manual. It became wildly inconsistent. A recipe that worked for one generation might be lost by the next. In most of Europe, the knowledge just disappeared entirely. The great art of turning milk into a durable treasure, something the Romans had turned into a science, reverted back to a game of chance. And for a few hundred years, it looked like the story of cheese in Europe might end right there, as a forgotten relic of a fallen empire, a culinary dark age. But in the silence and isolation of that collapse, something else was happening. Those few surviving pockets of knowledge weren't just surviving, they were beginning to change. Now that collapse we just talked about created a bizarre paradox for cheese. It was a dark age for just about everything, from literacy to engineering to public health. And that included cheese. On the one hand, in a world where trade routes are gone and political stability is a distant memory, cheese becomes more essential than ever. Think about it. There is no more Roman army to feed. There are no more grand cities with bustling markets. There is just your village, your farm, and the terrifying uncertainty of what the next season or the next week will bring. In that world, a salty, hard wheel of cheese isn't a commodity anymore. It's life insurance. It's the protein and fat from an entire summer's worth of milk, packed into a durable form that can get your family through a brutal winter, or a siege, or a failed harvest. It's the ultimate survival food for a collapsed civilization. It was, for the average person, more critical to staying alive than it had ever been under Roman rule. But here's the other side of that paradox. While cheese was more important than ever for just plain staying alive, the actual craft of making it was entering a kind of shadow history. The Roman blueprint was gone. The science was lost. All that was left was folk memory, a recipe passed from a mother to a daughter, getting a little distorted with each generation, like a photocopy of a photocopy. So the quality became a total crapshoot. Without the standardized presses, the measured salt, and the written instructions, cheesemaking reverted to pure alchemy. One village might, by sheer luck, hold on to a tradition that produced a decent, edible product. But the village just a few miles down the road might be making a sour, rotting mess. There was no consistency, no quality control. For hundreds of years, making a good cheese was basically a lucky accident. It was both the most important food in Europe and a forgotten, broken art. And it might have been lost for good, if not for the one institution that managed to preserve the knowledge of the old world through all the chaos. So, at the end of all the chaos of a collapsed empire, cheese was an essential but broken art, a forgotten science that might have disappeared completely if not for one institution that preserved the knowledge of the old world. And that institution, of course, was the monastery. Now think about it. In a world of violence, chaos, and uncertainty, monasteries became these isolated, protected bubbles of order and routine. And for the monks living inside them, particularly the Benedictines, their entire existence was governed by a simple rule: ora et labora, pray and work. And a huge part of that work was being completely self-sufficient. They had to grow their own grain, brew their own beer, and most importantly, manage their own herds of animals. They had the land, they had the livestock, and they had a dedicated, incredibly disciplined labor force that wasn't going anywhere. But here's the absolute game changer. In a world that had become overwhelmingly illiterate, the monks could read and write. They were the obsessive record keepers of the Dark Ages. They wrote everything down. So while the rest of Europe was struggling to remember a recipe passed down by a grandparent, monks were digging into the abbey library and reading the original Roman agricultural texts by writers like Columella. And they weren't just reading, they were running experiments. They meticulously documented every single step of their cheese-making process: the amount of salt, the pressing time, the temperature of the aging cave, the specific season's milk. What worked got repeated and refined. What failed was recorded as a warning to the next generation. The lucky accidents of folk tradition were being replaced once again by science. And this is where the map of modern cheese really begins to get drawn. The Benedictine and later the Cistercian orders didn't just save cheese-making, they began to perfect it, creating foundational varieties that are still famous today. In the Vosges Mountains of France, Benedictine monks created a pungent, washed rind cheese that took its name directly from the Latin word for monastery, monasterium. We still call it Munster. Monks in the south of France were the first to systematize the aging of ewe's milk cheese in the natural limestone caves of Roquefort, mastering the wild blue mold that grew there. And in the Po Valley of Italy, Benedictine and Cistercian monks began a project so ambitious it would reset the standard for what cheese could be. They needed a cheese that could age for years, a durable repository of wealth. Using the milk from the massive herds of cattle they managed, they developed a massive, hard-cooked, long-aged cheese we now know as Parmigiano Reggiano, Parmesan. These weren't just survival foods anymore. Thanks to the monks, cheese was reborn as an art form, a technology, and a source of incredible wealth. They had not only rescued the past, they had invented the future of flavor. So, the monks had rescued cheesemaking from the brink. They had taken a broken, forgotten craft, and through sheer discipline and obsessive record-keeping, turned it back into a science. But here's where something completely new, and honestly, kind of magical, starts to happen. Because the monks weren't just documenting their recipes, they were documenting the results. And as they compared notes between different abbeys, a startling pattern began to emerge. A cheese made by the Benedictines in the Alps didn't taste anything like a cheese made by the Benedictines in Normandy, even when they followed the exact same set of instructions. At first, this must have been incredibly frustrating. They were trying to create a standardized, repeatable process, but the earth itself seemed to be refusing to cooperate. And then they realized that wasn't a flaw, it was a feature. Think about it. The cows grazing in a high mountain pasture in Switzerland are eating different grasses and wildflowers than the cows grazing on the flat, mineral-rich lowlands of northern Italy. And those unique flavor compounds from the forage, they pass directly into the milk. The specific humidity of one river valley versus another totally changes how a cheese loses moisture as it ages. The temperature of a natural cave carved out of limestone is different from a cellar dug into clay soil. And here's the most important part, the invisible genius of the whole thing, the microbes. Remember way back at the beginning when we mentioned Roquefort and the specific blue mold that only grows in those caves? Well, it turns out every single one of these aging cellars had its own unique, microscopic ecosystem, a native population of yeasts, bacteria, and molds that had evolved over thousands of years in that one specific place, and which couldn't be found anywhere else on Earth. The monks couldn't see them, but these tiny organisms were the secret ingredient, the final step in the recipe that was literally in the air. And when you put all of that together, the geology of the soil, the plants the animals ate, the local climate, the invisible army of microbes in the cellar, you get a food that is an expression of a single, unique place. A flavor that could not, under any circumstances, be replicated 50 miles down the road. This was the birth of an idea that the French would later call terroir, a taste of the place itself. The monks, in their quest for holy perfection, had accidentally become the world's first connoisseurs. They weren't just making food anymore, they were bottling geography. So, the monks had done it. They had turned cheese into bottled geography. A flavor so deeply tied to a specific patch of earth, its grass, its water, its very air, that it couldn't be replicated anywhere else. It's an incredibly romantic idea, right? The ultimate local food. But here's the thing about bottling geography. It only really works if you stay in one place. And while the monks were perfecting their art in quiet abbeys, the world outside was getting ready to explode. This is the dawn of the age of exploration. Suddenly, people aren't just traveling down the road or across a sea. They're launching themselves into the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, on voyages that could last for months, even years. And this created a logistical nightmare that makes our Neolithic shepherd's journey look like a walk in the park. How do you feed a crew of 100 men when you have no idea where you're going or when you'll ever see land again? Your salted meat rots. Your biscuits, the infamous hardtack, become infested with weevils. You need a food that is dense, durable, and packed with calories. You need a new kind of cheese. And it wouldn't be the delicate, terroir-driven cheeses of the monasteries. It would be something far more brutal and functional. Something engineered not for flavor, but for survival. This was the age of the Dutch. Cheeses like Edam and Gouda were designed for war and for trade. They were made with incredibly low moisture, pressed into dense, cannonball-like spheres, and then, most brilliantly, sealed in a thick coating of coloured wax. It was armour. This wax shell made the cheese almost impervious to moisture loss and contamination. It was a self-contained, edible battery pack. A wheel of Dutch Edam could last, with no special care, for years. And this is where the story of cheese goes global, because those ships weren't just carrying cheese as a ration, they were carrying the means of production. On board these crowded vessels, crammed in with the cannons and the crew, were live animals. Specifically, they were European cattle. So as explorers like Columbus and Vasco da Gama established ports and colonies from the Americas to the Indies, they brought their cows with them. They were transplanting their entire dairy culture, establishing a foothold for European milk in landscapes that had never seen it before. Cheese was no longer just a taste of Europe. It was becoming the vehicle for exporting Europe itself. So, when we say cheese became the vehicle for exporting Europe itself, what does that actually mean? It sounds grand, but the reality on the ground was incredibly brutal, because you weren't just exporting a food, you were exporting the entire biological engine needed to produce it. And in this case, that engine was the European cow. These animals were, to put it mildly, an ecological wrecking ball. When European cattle were introduced to the Americas, to Australia, and to New Zealand, they entered ecosystems that had never seen a heavy, hard-hoofed, intensive grazing animal before. Native grasses were trampled into mud. Delicate soils were compacted. Waterways were polluted. The very shape of the land was being rewritten by the relentless munching of foreign livestock. And wherever these new herds went, the landscape was completely re-engineered to support them. And then came the fences. Vast stretches of land that had been open for countless generations were suddenly enclosed, parcelled up, and turned into private pasture. A European concept imposed on a non-European world. Indigenous foodways that had sustained people for millennia. Hunting grounds for bison in North America, incredibly complex fire-based agriculture in Australia, were suddenly obsolete, replaced by endless green fields for grazing foreign animals. Let's be blunt about what was really happening here. This wasn't a friendly food exchange. It was an invasion, powered by milk and curd. The very idea of terroir, that beautiful, romantic notion the monks had discovered of a food tasting like a specific place, was being turned on its head. Now, the goal was to erase the taste of the place and replace it with the uniform, profitable taste of Europe. So the next time you see a block of cheddar from New Zealand or a Monterey Jack from California, it's worth remembering that that cheese has a shadow history, a flavour built not just on the pasture it came from, but on the world that was erased to create it. So, for centuries, that was the model. From the monks perfecting terroir in their abbeys, to the colonizers remaking entire continents into pasture land, the fundamental rule of cheesemaking had always been the same. It was a farm-based craft. You had your animals, you had your milk, and you made your cheese. But here's the problem with that model. It's slow, it's inefficient, and most of all, it's incredibly inconsistent. Think about it. On a farm, you're at the mercy of 100 tiny variables. The mood of the cows, a sudden change in the weather, the slightest error by the cheesemaker. Any one of them could turn a potentially valuable wheel of cheese into a sour, unsellable mess. It was a massive risk, and if your family's livelihood depended on those wheels selling at market, a few bad batches could ruin you. Which brings us to a dairyman from upstate New York named Jesse Williams. Williams was a successful cheesemaker, but he had a problem. His son was also a cheesemaker, but his son's cheese just wasn't as good, and it wasn't fetching the same price, and Williams knew that this was the fundamental weakness of the entire system. How could you build a real business on a craft that was entirely dependent on the individual skill, or lack thereof, of one person on one farm? So he came up with a new plan, an idea so simple and so revolutionary it would change the world of cheese forever. The logic was brutally simple. Instead of every farmer in the area making their own small, inconsistent batches of cheese, what if they all just pooled their milk together? What if they all just brought their fresh milk to one central building, a place with the best equipment, the most space, and the most skilled cheesemaker, him, to turn it all into one massive, uniform, high-quality product? And in 1851, he did it. He convinced his neighbours, took their milk, and created the first modern cheese factory. This was the rupture. And this is a massive deal, because with the invention of the factory, cheesemaking was suddenly ripped from its ancient roots. It was no longer an agricultural act, tied to a specific herd in a specific pasture. It was now an industrial process. The goal was no longer to create a taste of the land, that whole romantic idea of terroir. The goal was to create a reliable, scalable, and above all, profitable commodity. The age of the artisan was coming to an end. The age of the cheese block was about to begin. All right, so the factory model has arrived. Jesse Williams has solved the problem of scale, turning 1,000 tiny farm operations into one massive, efficient production line. It was a revolution. But it created a new problem, a much, much bigger one. Think about it. When you're pooling milk from dozens or even hundreds of different farms, you're not just pooling milk. You're pooling risk. One sick cow, one dirty pail, one batch of milk infected with some nasty bacteria, and you've just contaminated thousands of gallons. The entire output of the factory could be ruined. Worse, it could be deadly. The very efficiency that made the factory so brilliant also made it an incredible biological time bomb. And this is where another major catalyst enters our story. A French chemist who wasn't even thinking about cheese. His name was Louis Pasteur. Pasteur had been hired by France's wine industry to figure out why their wine and beer were so often spoiling. And his discovery, presented in 1864, was utterly transformative. He found that if you gently heated the liquid to a specific temperature for a certain amount of time, it killed the harmful microbes responsible for spoilage, without ruining the product. He called the process pasteurization. For the new industrial cheesemakers, this was nothing short of a miracle. It was the answer to their single biggest problem. You could take all that milk from all those different farms, pasteurize it, and instantly eliminate the risk of contamination and spoilage. It made cheesemaking predictable, reliable, and above all safe on a scale never before imaginable. The biological time bomb was diffused. But here's the thing about pasteurization. It's a sledgehammer, not a scalpel. It doesn't just kill the bad stuff, the listeria, the E. coli, the microbes that could make you sick. It kills everything. All those unique, wild, native microflora we talked about, the ones that lived in a specific patch of earth and gave a cheese its soul, wiped out. The specific strain of yeast floating in the air of one abbey's cellar that made their cheese taste like nothing else on earth, gone. The entire complex ecosystem that created the magic of terroir was completely annihilated in a bath of high heat. And with that, the taste of cheese was fundamentally, and perhaps permanently, altered. It became a blank slate. The flavor no longer came from the specific land or the unique air. It came from whatever lab-grown starter cultures the factory decided to add back into the sterile milk. The goal was no longer a taste of a place. The goal was a taste that was exactly the same every single time, whether it was made in Wisconsin or in upstate New York. It was the ultimate trade-off. We gained safety, but we lost geography. The very science that made cheese safe enough for the masses was the same science that began to strip it of its identity, creating a standardized product for a standardized world. So, we've arrived at the blank slate. Thanks to pasteurization, the cheese factory can now produce a product that is perfectly safe and perfectly uniform. The unpredictable soul of terroir has been scientifically exterminated in the name of consistency. But here's the thing. Even this sterilized factory-made cheese wasn't perfect. Not for the modern world anyway. It still had a limited shelf life. It still needed to be kept cool. And most annoyingly, when you tried to melt it, it would break. The oils would separate from the solids, and you'd end up with a greasy, stringy mess. For an industrial food system obsessed with reliability, this was still a bug. It wasn't a feature. And that bug was driving a Chicago cheese wholesaler named James L. Kraft completely insane. Kraft wasn't a cheesemaker. He was a businessman, and his business was losing a ton of money every time a wheel of cheddar went moldy on a hot day. He wasn't trying to capture the subtle flavors of a Swiss Alp. He was trying to solve a logistics problem. He wanted a cheese that behaved itself. So he started experimenting in his kitchen. And his brilliant, almost heretical idea was that the solution wasn't to make cheese better, but to take it apart and rebuild it from the ground up. He took all the leftover scraps and bits of regular cheddar that would normally be thrown out, ground them into a paste, heated them to kill every last microbe, and then, and this is the stroke of genius, he added an emulsifying salt, sodium phosphate. What that little chemical did was pure magic. It acted like a molecular peacemaker, forcing the fats and proteins in the cheese to hold hands and never let go, even under extreme heat. The result, which he patented in 1916, was something the world had never seen before. It was a food product that called itself cheese, but which was now utterly, completely immortal. It was sterilized to the point of no return, so it could sit on a shelf, unrefrigerated, for months. And when it was heated, it didn't break, it didn't get greasy. It slumped into a flawless, uniform, impossibly smooth, gooey blanket of molten perfection. This wasn't just a new kind of cheese. It was the invention of a new food category, one that would come to define the American diet for the entire 20th century. It was processed cheese. So, we have processed cheese, the perfect, immortal, industrial food product invented by a businessman trying to solve a logistics problem. It's hard to imagine cheese getting any further from that romantic ideal of terroir, right? Well, what happens when it's not just a corporation, but the United States government itself that decides to get into the cheese business? You get one of the strangest, most surreal chapters in the history of any food. You get government cheese. Now, this whole story is a classic case of good intentions leading to absolutely insane consequences. It all starts in the years after World War II. In an effort to support dairy farmers and ensure a stable national food supply during the Cold War, the US government made a simple, fateful promise. They would buy up any surplus milk that farmers couldn't sell on the open market. And you can probably guess what happened next. With a guaranteed buyer who would pay a fixed price, dairy farmers did the only logical thing. They went into overdrive. They produced milk like their lives depended on it. The surplus wasn't a trickle, it was a tidal wave. And the government, stuck with its promise, had to buy all of it. But you can't just stockpile liquid milk. So they converted it into the most stable form they knew. They turned it into cheese, and butter, and powdered milk. A lot of it. And I mean a lot. By the early 1980s, the US government was sitting on a literal mountain of cheese. We're talking more than 500 million pounds of the stuff, stored in vast, refrigerated underground caves and warehouses across the country. It was an economic and political embarrassment. A cheese hoard of such staggering proportions, it was costing millions just to keep cold. So, the Reagan administration came up with a new plan: give it away. The cheese was distributed through the welfare initiative called the Commodity Supplemental Food Program. And suddenly, millions of low-income Americans started receiving a new and very distinct food staple: a 5-pound rectangular block of bright orange, Velveeta-like processed cheese packaged in a plain, no-frills cardboard box. And this is where the legacy gets complicated. For decades, government cheese became a powerful cultural symbol. For many, it was a mark of shame, a signifier of poverty that you had to stand in line for. It was the food of last resort, the butt of jokes. But for the very same people, it was also a lifeline. It was a reliable source of protein and calories that fed millions of children. It became the gooey heart of countless grilled cheese sandwiches and macaroni casseroles. It was both a symbol of struggle and a symbol of survival, a taste of hard times that, for a whole generation, also tasted a little bit like home. So, a 5-pound block of bright orange, government-issued processed cheese. It feels like the end of the line, doesn't it? The absolute final step in a journey that took us from a sheep's stomach canteen to a sterile factory, and finally to a government warehouse. This wasn't food as culture or as art, or even as survival. This was cheese as pure, unadulterated logistics, a tool of macroeconomic policy, a commodity so completely disconnected from its origins, from the animal, the pasture, the very idea of a place, that it was little more than a solid, edible representation of a farm subsidy. It was the ultimate triumph of the factory, the final victory of the blank slate, the anti-terroir. But here's the thing, that's not where the story ends, not even close. Because at the exact same time that the US government was building a literal mountain of processed cheese in subterranean caves. A quiet and completely opposite revolution was starting to bubble up. A counter-reformation. While the world was drowning in uniform, pasteurized, emulsified cheese blocks, a few people started asking a simple question. What did we lose? And they went looking for it. All across Europe and North America, a new generation of cheesemakers, rebels really, began to deliberately turn their backs on the factory. They sought out the old ways, the very traditions that industrialization had tried so hard to eliminate. They went back to the raw, unpasteurized milk. They embraced the unpredictable funk of native yeasts and wild molds. They reread the monks' old playbooks and reignited the near-extinguished flame of terroir. And so, the great paradox of our modern age was born. The factory didn't win, but it didn't lose either. The two paths, the industrial and the artisanal, didn't converge. They just kept going, running parallel to each other, both exploding at the same time. Which is how we ended up here. In a world that can contain both a billion-dollar market for fluorescent orange mac and cheese powder and a single, hand-washed wheel of Époisses de Bourgogne so pungent it's illegal to carry on public transport in France. Remember way back at the beginning, we talked about the staggering, insane range of what we call cheese. Well, that range isn't just a random collection of products. It's the living, edible fossil record of this entire 8,000-year story. That fresh, soft, goat cheese. That's the Neolithic survival hack, the hard, salty pecorino. That's the ration that fueled the Roman legions, the delicate, cave-aged blue. That's the art perfected by a medieval monk, and that flawless, individually wrapped yellow slice. That's the legacy of James L. Kraft's kitchen experiments. They're all still here, all coexisting in the same refrigerated aisle. From a happy accident born of desperation, to the fuel of empires, to a symbol of poverty, to a multi-billion-dollar canvas for artistry. The entire epic, ridiculous journey is right there for the tasting. It's all just managed decay, a symphony conducted against rot, playing its tune on 1,000 different stages at once.